Hi, Mrs. Colgan, just picking up where I left off. I waited for a call from my sister that night, but it didn't come until late Friday night from Chicago. On the way. On Saturday morning, I told my parents at breakfast that my sister would be at the Port Authority in New York at 10:50 that morning. They looked at me like I had just chanted Hebrew. "She'll be in the Port Authority at 10:50?" repeated my mother. Her hand was up to her mouth. Her eyes suddenly filled. "Yes," I said. "How is she going to get home from there?" asked my father. "I guess she was hoping you would go and pick her up." "Of course," said my father. "Of course I'll drop everything and pick her up. Of course I have nothing else to do." He stood up. "If she went out in a yellow bug, she can come home in a yellow bug." "She's alone," I said. "You're not going to see me driving all the way into the city on a Saturday. She can take the train." "She may be out of money." "Well, whose problem is that?" he said. "It doesn't matter whose problem it is. She can't get back home unless you go get her," I said. He looked at me. "Who do you think you're talking to?" he said. "She needs help." "Then you go get her, Holling. The car keys are up on my dresser." He laughed. "Okay," I said. "Okay," he said, and went outside to start up the lawnmower. I went upstairs and got the car keys. The Ford Mustang car keys, not the station wagon. "Holling," said my mother when I came back down. I think he was being sarcastic. I went to the front closet and found my jacket. "Holling, what are you doing?" I held up the car keys. "I'm driving into New York City to pick up my sister from the Port Authority bus terminal at 10:50. "You don't know how to drive. I've seen movies." I went to the front door. "Holling," said my mother. I turned around. "You can't drive in by yourself." "Then come with me." She looked out to the backyard. "We can't do that either," she said, and her voice was as sad and lost as loneliness. I went out to the garage and sat in the Mustang. The red leather still smelled new. The steering wheel felt right in my hands. It wasn't like I'd never driven before. My mother had let me drive the station wagon around parking lots, the big ones down at Jones Beach, where you can go for 2 or 3 miles before you hit anything more dangerous than a seagull. I'd gotten out of first gear plenty of times, and even up into third gear twice. And the Mustang was smaller and handier than the station wagon. I probably just had to think about turning, and the car would feel it. But driving around Jones Beach parking lots is a whole lot different from driving on the Long Island Expressway into New York City. And even if I could get onto the expressway, I wouldn't know what exit to get off. Toads, beetles, bats. I came back inside. I threw the keys on the kitchen counter. My mother was putting out a cigarette and starting to make pound cake for lunch. Outside, the mower fussed at the edges of the lawn. I went into the living room and sat down on the couch. And Merrill Lee called, because her father was going into Yankee Stadium. Would I like to come? "Can I get to the Port Authority from Yankee Stadium?" I said. Merrill Lee asked her father. "It's too far, but he says that if you can leave right now, we'll have just enough time to drop you off." She was quiet a moment. "I think he feels like he owes you something," she said. I went into the kitchen. "I need money for 2 train tickets," I said. "Train tickets?" my mother said. "And money for 2 lunches." She stared at me. "Big lunches," I said. She went upstairs for her pocketbook. I was there when the bus from Chicago pulled in at 10:50. The Port Authority was all noise and rushing. The accumulated combustion from the buses had thickened the air. The whoosh and squeak and hollering of the brakes, and the distorted announcements over the PA system, and the newsboys hawking, and the pell-mell of more bodies than belong in any one building, gave the place a general roar. As for the floor, you couldn't have found a greater confusion if the ceiling had been lifted off and the sky had rained down ticket stubs and newspapers and Baby Ruth wrappers. But as soon as the 10:50 bus from Chicago parked itself, everything stopped. The rush, the roar, the squeak, the whoosh, they all stopped. Really, like Leonid Brezhnev had sent over an atomic bomb and wiped it all out. They did not start up again until my sister got off the bus, and she ran out of the diesel combustion and right to me, and we held each other, and we were not empty at all. "Holling," she said, "I was so afraid I wouldn't find you." "I was standing right here, Heather," I said. "I'll always be standing right here." For lunch, we had grilled cheese sandwiches and Cokes and chocolate donuts at a counter in the Port Authority. Outside, we bought pretzels from a stand, and then we walked to Central Park hand in hand. We lay down in the sheep meadow, and my sister told me about driving west with the sun on your face. We got up and walked around the pond and stopped at an outcropping of boulders that fell out of the woods. Around us was every shade of green you could ever hope to imagine, broken up here and there with a flowering tree blushing to a light pink. All the colors were garbled and reflected in the tiny ripples of the water. Then through the wandering paths of the ramble, looking as if we were up in the mountains of California, and then across the Bethesda Terrace, where we sat on the stone walls and traced the carvings with our fingers, until someone hollered at us to get off there. Then back along the mall underneath tall elms until we passed the statue of, no kidding, William Shakespeare, who stared down at us sternly, probably because he is wearing tights and is embarrassed doing that in front of everybody. We walked slowly. We talked a little. I told her about our atomic bomb drills and about our town, and about the tragedy of Hamlet, Prince of Denmark. She told me about Minneapolis and how she got out of the yellow bug and wouldn't get back in, and how Chit drove away, and about going to the Western Union and finding the money for the ticket and falling asleep for the first time in 2 days on the bus to Chicago. But mostly, we didn't talk. It was spring in Central Park, and being there with my sister was enough. We took the train out of the city and walked from the station. When we got back home, it didn't matter that my mother had made us burned grilled cheese sandwiches for supper. It was just so good that the house wasn't empty anymore. My father said only one thing during supper. "Did you find yourself?" "What?" said my sister. "Did you find yourself?" "She found me," I said. By the end of the tragedy of Hamlet, Prince of Denmark, Laertes is stabbed, the queen is poisoned, and the king is poisoned and stabbed, which is pretty much the same thing that happens to Hamlet. By the time it's all over, there are these dead bodies all over the stage, and even though Horatio is hoping that flights of angels are coming to sing Hamlet to his rest, it's hard to believe that there's any rest for him. Maybe he knew that. Maybe that's why he dressed in black all the time. Maybe it's why he was never happy. Maybe he looked in all the wrong places trying to find himself. Or maybe he never had someone to tell him that he didn't need to find himself. He just needed to let himself be found. That's what I think Shakespeare was trying to say about what it means to be a human being in the tragedy of Hamlet, Prince of Denmark. And speaking of being found, that's what happened to Lieutenant Baker, too. Really. After almost 3 months in the jungles of Vietnam, he got found. I was there on the last Wednesday afternoon of May, a cool and blue day, when Mrs. Sidman came in with an envelope and handed it to Mrs. Baker. She took it with hands that were trembling. She tore the top slowly open and then stood there holding the telegram unable to pull it out to read it. "Can I help?" said Mrs. Sidman. Mrs. Baker nodded. "And then I'll take Holling to my office so that you can be alone." Mrs. Baker looked at me, and I knew she wasn't going to send me to Mrs. Sidman's office so that she could be alone. You don't send someone away who has lit a candle with you. "I suppose not," said Mrs. Baker. Mrs. Sidman took the envelope, then held out the opened telegram to Mrs. Baker. But Mrs. Baker closed her eyes. "Read it," she whispered. Mrs. Sidman looked at me, then down at the telegram. Then she read the first line. "Sweet eyes, stop. Think of the sound you make when you let go after holding your breath for a very, very long time. Think of the gladdest sounds you know, the sound of dawn on the first day of spring break, the sound of a bottle of Coke opening, the sound of a crowd cheering in your ears because you're coming down to the last part of a race. And you're ahead. Think of the sound of water over stones in a cold stream and the sound of wind through green trees on a late May afternoon in Central Park. Think of the sound of a bus coming into the station, carrying someone you love. Then put all those together, and they would be nothing compared to the sound that Mrs. Baker made that day from somewhere deep inside that had almost given up when she heard the first line of that telegram. Then she started to hiccup and to cry and to laugh, and Mrs. Sidman put the telegram down, held Mrs. Baker in her arms, nodded to me, and took her out of the classroom for a drink of water. And I know I shouldn't have, but I picked up the telegram and read the rest. Here is what it said. "Sweet eyes, stop. Out of jungle, stop. Okay, stop. Home in time for strawberries, stop. Love, Ty, stop." Shakespeare couldn't write any better than that.